Picture this, giant dark clouds are gathering on the horizon, the winds are getting stronger by the second, warnings of the deadly Hurricane Milton are blaring from every screen and radio. Time is running out and panic is starting to set in. A family desperate to save themselves turns to a police officer who is supposed to protect and serve, but instead of helping, this officer looks at them with a cold stare and refuses, simply because they are black. Just imagine the fear, the injustice, as time ticks and the danger mounts with each passing moment. Write your name and where you watch us from in the comments right now. This is very important to us. We read every comment, and you help us grow and share important stories with the world. We are not just a channel, we are a community, and each of you is incredibly important to us. Let's help those in trouble together. Write in the comments how, in your opinion, we can help the victims of the hurricane. Your likes, comments and subscriptions move us forward. You are our heroes who help bring light in the darkest moments. This story is based on a true story. Unfortunately, situations like this happen in our world, even when lives are at stake. This case reminds us that systemic racism can manifest itself even in the most critical moments. Enjoy watching. The sky darkened so quickly it was as if someone had turned off the lights over Florida. Alarm sirens blared on the radio and phones, warning that Hurricane Milton was coming. The wind howled, tearing through trees, and the streets filled with water. Panic grew. People rushed out of their homes, loading their cars with whatever they could save. For the Wilsons, a black couple with 2 small children, every moment was precious, but when they tried to leave, their old car wouldn't start. The tires skidded on the soggy ground, but the car stayed glued to the spot. "We have to get out of here," Thomas, the father of the family, said nervously, gripping the steering wheel. "Damn car!" His wife, Michelle, hugged her 2 children, trying not to show them her fear, but there was hopelessness in her eyes. "Thomas, we can't stay here. The water is rising. We have to call for help," she whispered in a trembling voice, feeling the water begin to flood the road. They noticed a patrol car driving slowly down the street. Thomas ran out to greet the officer, waving. The police car stopped. The officer, a white man with a cold expression, slowly got out of the car. There was no sympathy on his face, only tired irritation. "How can I help you?" the policeman asked indifferently, as if not noticing the horrific situation around him. "Officer, our car is broken," Thomas began, his voice shaking. "We can't leave. Please help us evacuate. We have 2 children, and the hurricane is already here." The officer looked Thomas up and down, his gaze icy, as if he had already made his decision. "I can't," the policeman replied, frowning. "I have other priorities. The road is already clogged, and I don't have time to deal with every problem." But Thomas tried to explain that the situation was critical, but the policeman had already turned his back and headed back to the car. "Look for help somewhere else," the officer said over his shoulder, not even looking back. His indifference seemed frighteningly inhuman. Michelle and the children approached her husband, overhearing the entire conversation. The children's eyes reflected fear when they realized that the policeman was not going to help. Little Lisa, their 6-year-old daughter, quietly asked, "Dad, why doesn't Uncle want to help?" Thomas didn't know what to say. He looked at the policeman who was already getting into the car and felt anger rising in his chest. "Officer, we have 2 children," he shouted, no longer able to contain his anger. "Don't you see what's happening? You're leaving us to die." The policeman turned slowly, opening the door of his car. His gaze was blank, his voice icy. "Your problem is not my problem, and it is not for you to tell me who to save. It's because we're black, right?" Michelle couldn't help but say, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "If we were white, you would have evacuated us already." The policeman paused for a moment, as if weighing whether to answer. Then his lips curled into a barely perceptible smile. "I don't have to answer questions like that, but if it's any consolation, I wouldn't help you, whoever you are." With that, he closed the door and drove away, leaving his family standing in shock in the midst of the growing storm. The wind was picking up, the rain was pouring down, and the hurricane was closing in. Thomas looked at his family, at Michelle, trying to hold back her tears, at the children they had promised to protect. His heart clenched with horror and rage. "We can't give up," he said, squeezing his wife's hand. "We have to find a way to get out of here." The rain began to fall harder, turning the street into a raging river. The water rose quickly, taking over sidewalks and flooding entryways. Every minute was precious. The wind howled through the trees, tearing branches out and throwing them to the ground like toys. Thomas and Michelle stood in shock, realizing that the police officer who was supposed to protect them had abandoned them to their fate. "Thomas, what are we going to do?" Michelle asked in a trembling voice, clutching her children as if trying to shield them from the impending horror. Thomas looked around the street, his searching gaze running through the houses. But everything was quiet. The neighbors had long since left, some in cars, some in evacuation buses. It seemed as if the whole world had already abandoned this sunken area, leaving them alone in the face of the impending catastrophe. We have to find help," Thomas squeezed out, although he himself understood that in this storm the chances were becoming less and less. The water was already approaching the threshold of their house, swamping the wheels of their broken car. Thomas looked at it with bitterness. Their old Honda, which had served them faithfully for so many years, had now betrayed them at the most necessary moment. He tried unsuccessfully to start the engine again, but only a weak hiss in response. "Dull." "Mom, I'm scared," Lisa said quietly, clinging to her mother. Her younger brother, Jason, was silent, but his eyes, full of terror, said everything. "Don't be afraid, honey. We'll get through this." Michelle tried to sound confident, but there was more fear in her voice than she intended. Sirens sounded again in the distance, but now they seemed even further away. No one was in a hurry to return for them. No one was going to help. Thomas suddenly felt the full weight of their situation. They, a family with 2 small children, were victims not only of the elements, but also of cruelty, cold indifference, mixed with outright racism. "Damn it," Thomas blurted out, his fists clenching in helpless rage. How could he just turn away? How could he leave people to die? The police car he had just seen disappeared around the corner, and Thomas couldn't help but think that if they had been white, things would have been different. This officer simply didn't want to help. To him, their lives didn't matter. "Thomas, look!" Michelle shouted, pointing to the far end of the street. Thomas turned around and saw the water level continuing to rise rapidly. The dirty streams of water were now engulfing cars, garbage cans, and anything else that came their way. The swollen streams began to gush onto the road with such force that the asphalt was literally dissolving in the muddy streams. "We have to go." Thomas jumped up, scooping Jason up in his arms. "We can't wait any longer." "But where?" Michelle frantically looked around the surroundings, looking for at least some kind of shelter. Their house was no longer safe. Water was seeping in through the doors and windows. It seemed that just a little more and their house would become their grave. They ran across the flooded street, the cold water lashing their legs, each step a struggle. The children were crying, but Thomas and Michelle tried to ignore it, moving forward through the raging torrents. Their strength was fading fast, but they couldn't afford to stop. There was no one around, just the water and the distant wail of sirens. Suddenly, Thomas saw bright headlights in the distance. A car! This was their chance. He waved his arms desperately, hoping that the driver would notice them. The car slowed down and stopped at a safe distance. Thomas rushed forward, but when the car doors opened, the same policeman stepped out. "You?" Thomas croaked, his voice full of despair and hope mixed with anger. "You're back?" The policeman stood before them, his face still cold and indifferent. He looked them over, as if assessing whether they were worth his time. And then, with an icy grin, he said, "I shouldn't have come back, but I wanted to see how long you could last. The elements don't discriminate, do they? Everyone has an equal chance. It's just that some people don't know how to use it." Thomas couldn't believe his ears. This man standing in front of them was enjoying their suffering. There was no humanity in his words or his eyes. It was as if the policeman was deliberately stalling for time, knowing that every second could cost his family their lives. "Please, officer," Michelle begged, holding back tears. "We have children. We can't stay here. You're the only one who can help us." The policeman came closer, his face twisted into a grin. "Maybe if you had thought about your safety in advance, you wouldn't have had to humiliate yourself. But you know what's interesting? How many times have you encountered such situations yourself? Well, now you're here. Cope as best you can." With these words, he turned back to the car, as if mocking their defenselessness. Thomas watched the police car drive away, hardly believing his eyes. The cop who should have been their only chance of salvation had not only refused to help, he had mocked them, enjoyed their suffering. The feeling of cold, Inhuman cruelty was almost unbearable. The water continued to rise around them, reaching their knees, its icy grip filling the air with an eerie sense of doom. "We can't just wait, Thomas," Michelle said, her voice shaking as she clutched their crying daughter. Lisa couldn't hold back her sobs any longer, her body shaking with fear and cold. "He won't come back. No one will." "I know," Thomas said, trying to contain his anger and despair, but his heart was torn apart by the terrifying thought. What if this was the end? What if this officer had just signed their death warrant? They were alone, all alone. The water was rising too fast. The wind was howling like an angry shadow of impending disaster, and the giant dark clouds hanging over Florida seemed an ominous reminder of Hurricane Milton's inexorable approach. "Daddy, I'm scared," Lisa whispered again, clinging to her mother's arms. Jason, her little brother, froze in terror, his big eyes full of tears. "It's going to be okay, baby," Thomas tried to reassure her, but even he didn't believe his words. Panic washed over him like a raging torrent of water around their feet. He wanted to scream, but there was no one to scream at. It was as if the world had turned its back on them. "We need to find higher ground," Michelle said quickly. "Somewhere higher. Maybe a roof. Anything." Thomas nodded. They ran to their house, climbing the threshold, which was already half submerged in water. He looked at the porch. It was clear that the inside of the house was already starting to flood. Water was coming through the cracks in the door, flooding the rooms. "To the roof," Thomas exhaled heavily. "We need to get to the roof." He lifted Jason onto his shoulder, feeling the boy's body tremble with cold and fear, and together with Michelle they hurried up the slippery steps that led to the hatch to the attic. Inside the house there was a hum, an eerie echo of the raging storm and the ominous gurgle of water flooding the lower floors. The walls shook under the blows of the wind, and each gust made the house shudder as if it were made of fragile cardboard. "Hurry!" Michelle screamed in panic, trying to climb into the attic with the children. The hatch was heavier than they expected, but Thomas pushed it with all his strength, opening the way up. The water below continued to rise, flooding almost the entire first floor. When they finally reached the attic, the world outside the house became even more ominous. The noise of the hurricane was deafening. The roar of the wind crashing against the walls and the whistling of the storm wind created an atmosphere of almost complete terror. They managed to climb onto the roof through a small exit, and before their eyes there was a scene that only increased the feeling of hopelessness. Water flooded everything around them. Streets became seething rivers. Cars sank in muddy whirlpools. Trees were torn out by the roots and floated in the streams like huge pieces of debris. Their home was now an island in the sea, and salvation seemed as unattainable as the horizon. "Thomas," Michelle whispered, her voice shaking with fear, "we won't survive. If we don't get help, we'll just drown." Thomas looked at his wife and children, his heart aching. He knew she was right. They couldn't leave the roof anymore, the only place they had shelter. The storm was too strong, and the water was rising too fast. "No, we can't give up," Thomas said, but his voice was full of despair. "Someone has to see us. They have to come back." But deep down, he knew it was a lie. That cop, he could have saved them, but instead he left them to die. Over and over in his head, the officer's last words echoed, "Do the best you can." There was a deafening crash overhead. Thomas looked up and saw a huge tree crashing down on the roof of their house. The branches pierced the roof, destroying part of it. They were almost trapped under these huge branches. Michelle screamed, shielding the children with her body. Thomas rushed towards them, but he already knew that this was only the beginning. The roof could collapse at any moment, and if they stayed here, they would not have a chance. The water was almost to the base of the roof, slowly but surely creeping toward them. It was inevitable. Thomas felt the fear growing inside him, but he had to stay strong for his family, for Lisa and Jason, for Michelle. "We won't die here," he whispered, even though he knew their chances were slim. At that moment, a roar was heard from afar. Another strong gust of wind hit the house, and a cracking sound was heard in the air, the same cracking that preceded the destruction. The wind was getting stronger, so strong that it seemed that it would tear off the entire roof of their house. Thomas, Michelle and the children were sitting in the attic, huddled together. The hurricane whistled around them, like an enraged beast, ready to fall upon them with the full wrath of nature. Fear seized each of them, and a heavy, unbearable silence hung in the air, broken only by the piercing sounds of the elements. "Thomas, we have to do something. We can't just sit and wait," Michelle whispered, trying to shout over the noise of the wind. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she tried to hold on for the sake of the children. "I know," Thomas managed, his voice full of despair. But where? We're surrounded by water. The cop, he abandoned us. The words caught in his throat, causing a feeling of helplessness that he couldn't contain. The policeman who could have saved them, the one who was supposed to serve and protect, had turned away at the most critical moment. All those years of Thomas believing in justice, in the help of the authorities, all that had now collapsed. At the moment when he needed help most, they were abandoned to their fate. Suddenly the roof began to creak and crack. Thomas looked up and saw one of the beams begin to sag under the pressure of the wind. The roar of the elements grew louder and it became clear that their shelter could collapse at any moment. He saw the water slowly but surely rising to the base of the attic. "We have to find something that will hold up. We can't just sit here," Thomas shouted, his voice filled with terror. He grabbed the nearest boxes and tried to push them against the walls, hoping that they would somehow support the structure if the roof collapsed. It was no use. The water kept coming, and the forces of the elements were relentless. Suddenly, there was a deafening roar. One of the massive trees, uprooted by the storm, fell directly onto the roof of the house, splitting it in half. Thomas, Michelle, and the children were thrown off their feet by the powerful shock wave as sections of the attic collapsed under the weight of the tree. The roof began to sag, and dirty water poured in. Thomas grabbed Jason, holding him close, trying to protect him from the falling debris. "Thomas," Michelle screamed, her voice almost drowned out by the roar of the wind. She tried to hold Lisa in her arms, but the flow of water was so strong that it almost swept them away. Thomas turned around. Part of the roof had collapsed, revealing a sky that was now flashing with deafening lightning. Rain was pouring down on them from above, mixing with the dirty water that was now covering the entire attic. They were trapped between the collapsed roof and the rapidly rising water. "We have to get out," Thomas shouted, his voice breaking. But where? Where could they run? All around them was water, destruction, and death, closing in on them with every gust of wind. At that moment he heard the dull sound of an approaching engine. Thomas jumped up, clinging to the slightest hope. Had someone really returned? Was rescue really possible? But when a car emerged from the darkness, his heart sank. It was the same patrol car, the cop who had abandoned them. Again, driving slowly through the flooded street. It seemed to mock their helplessness. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. The man had returned again, but not to save them. The officer stopped the car near the destroyed house and slowly got out. His face was still cold, indifferent. He looked around their flooded home as if he were watching a theater of the absurd. Thomas wanted to scream, to run towards him, but his legs wouldn't move. Fear and despair had paralyzed him. The officer crossed his arms over his chest and grinned. "Well, have you solved all your problems?" he said mockingly over the roar of the wind. "I told you, deal with it yourselves." "Please, we have children," Michelle cried, her voice shaking with horror. She begged him, seeing that there was no other way out. "Help us, they shouldn't die like this." The policeman just shook his head, as if enjoying the moment. "You knew what you were getting into. Everything that happened is your fault. No one forced you to stay. Black, white, it doesn't matter here. But you never learn. Always blame others for your mistakes." The words cut through Thomas like a knife. An explosion of anger filled him, but he knew he couldn't do anything. He wanted to throw himself at the man, but what would that change? The water was already surrounding them, the roof was collapsing, and they stood on the edge between life and death. The officer wasn't there to save them, he was there to watch them suffer. "If you don't want to help, just go away," Thomas shouted, his voice filled with impotent rage. "Leave us alone." The policeman paused for a moment, his cold gaze fixed on Thomas. Then he chuckled and slowly walked back to his car. "Good luck," he said before closing the door and driving away again, leaving his family to face the unforgiving elements. Thomas stood motionless, watching the car disappear into the darkness. Their last hope had faded, and now they were alone, finally and irrevocably. The water was already chest deep, and every movement was an incredible effort. Lisa was sobbing in Michelle's arms. Jason was cowering in Thomas's arms, and their eyes reflected only fear. "Thomas," Michelle began, her voice shaking, I don't know if we can survive this." He looked at her, at his family, realizing that in these conditions there were no chances left. The world around them was crumbling. The wind roaring above them seemed like an angry force of nature, avenging something ancient and unstoppable. Thunder shook the sky, lightning ripped through the darkness, revealing the chaos in which Thomas's family was trying to survive. Hurricane Milton had already consumed most of everything around them. Their home, once a fortress, was now a trap, caught between the destructive elements and the indifference of the world. The water rose inexorably, revealing the fragility of their situation. Thomas gritted his teeth, feeling his heart pounding in his chest so hard it felt like it would burst. His arms shook with the effort of holding Jason, who was still crying in his arms. Michelle, soaking wet, held Lisa tightly, but the desperation on her face showed that her strength was running out. She could no longer hold back her tears. All their hopes were slowly drowning in the raging streams of water that were rapidly taking over every corner of their home. And then there was the sound again, the sound that would have been their salvation at another time, but now only added to the horror. The headlights of a patrol car cut through the darkness, momentarily illuminating their doomed figures on the roof. Thomas looked up, his heart beating with hope again. He wanted to believe that the policeman had changed his mind, that maybe human kindness had won out after all. But when the officer stepped out of the car, Thomas saw his icy face, full of hatred and contempt. The policeman, the same one who had already left them for dead, walked to the edge of the road. There was no regret or compassion in his eyes. The wind was beating on him as mercilessly as on the others, but his firm stance spoke of an unshakable confidence in his own superiority. He glanced at the family trapped on the roof of their house and grinned again. "Are you still here?" he shouted loudly, above the roar of the wind. "What are you waiting for? Heaven won't help you. Please," Thomas shouted, his voice full of despair. "We can't get out on our own. We have children. Help us." The officer laughed, coldly, lifelessly, as if their pain was just a reason for him to mock. "Oh, now you need help?" He crossed his arms over his chest, as if enjoying the situation. "But when everything is calm, you always complain that we, the police, are unfair to you, that we do not respect you. Is that right? You always dislike something, and when trouble comes, suddenly it turns out that without us you cannot survive? We're not talking about politics," Michelle screamed, her voice full of despair and anger. "This is not the time for this. Our children could die. Can't you see?" The policeman came a little closer, but not to them. He went to the remains of the tree that had fallen on their house. He ran his hand over the wet bark, as if thinking about something, then slowly turned to Thomas. "You see," he began, his voice uncomfortably calm, like a man who knows he's in control. "I'm used to people like you always blaming us white people for all your problems, for crime, for poverty, for failure. It's always someone else's fault. And then when it comes time to pay the bills, suddenly you remember that we're needed, that without us, you're nothing." Thomas felt something inside him break. Anger and rage battled with helplessness. He saw how this man, instead of reaching out to help, was enjoying their suffering. But what could be worse? Hadn't this racist cop just left them to die? Thomas wanted to scream, but his voice betrayed him. "This hurricane isn't our fault," he shouted. "It's not because of our skin color. We just want to live." The policeman looked at him with a haughty grin, as if Thomas had said something absurd. "Maybe it's not your fault," the officer said slowly, studying him as if studying a caged animal. "But those are the rules. Every man for himself. Maybe if you hadn't put yourself against the system before, if you'd been more accommodating, we could have come to an agreement." "Agree?" Michelle couldn't stand it. "We don't have time for your games. The hurricane is destroying everything. Can't you see that if you don't help us now, we could die?" The policeman shrugged as if her words meant nothing. "People like you always scream the loudest when things go wrong," he said calmly, "always expecting someone to come and save you. But you see, the world doesn't work that way. In this world, the strongest survive, those who can fight for themselves." He turned away and headed towards his car, throwing over his shoulder, "Maybe you should have thought about it earlier. Maybe if you weren't so ungrateful, if you respected the system, you would have been helped." The words hung in the air like a final bolt of lightning. Thomas felt the ground beneath his feet as if it were giving way. The water had risen so high that they could barely stand on the roof. The waves pounded their legs, growing stronger with each passing minute. Hope faded as this man, representing the law, simply walked away, leaving them to the mercy of the elements. Thomas watched the policeman, who did not look back. His car slowly moved away, disappearing into the swirling water, leaving them alone in this nightmare. Never in his life had Thomas felt such rage mixed with despair. His strength was leaving him, and he knew they were truly alone. "Thomas," Michelle was shaking, her eyes full of tears. "What do we do now?" He looked at her, at his children, who were huddled at her feet, and did not know what to answer. The water continued to rise inexorably, filling every crack and crevice of their crumbling home. Thomas, knee-deep in the icy torrents, felt his body shrink from the cold and terror. He heard the roof creaking in the wind, ready to collapse at any moment, and he knew that they had very little time left. Every minute could be their last. Michelle, holding the children tightly to her, desperately tried to calm them down, but in her own eyes there was a fear that she could no longer resist. Lisa was crying, her small body shaking from the cold and fear, and Jason, pressed against his father, was silent, his eyes full of incomprehension. "We have to do something, Thomas," Michelle whispered, her voice breaking with desperation. "We can't just sit here and wait for us all to be washed away." "I know," he said, his voice hoarse, as if the weight of it all was crushing him from within. He tried to think, to find a solution, but his mind refused to work, overwhelmed by the horror that was taking hold of him. The policeman, their last hope, was gone, and they were alone, face to face with death. Another flash of lightning lit up the night sky, and for a moment everything was dazzled by the blaze. Thomas saw their small home surrounded by raging waters, trees snapping and wires smashing down from utility poles. It was like something out of a disaster movie, but it was happening to them, here and now. And worst of all, the policeman's face, his cold sneer, his contempt, his words laced with hatred, continued to ring in Thomas's ears. He couldn't get the way this man looked at them, as if they were worthless creatures, not worth helping. This policeman didn't see them as people, not as a family with children, but as objects of his contempt, to whom he would deny the right to save simply because their skin was a different color. "You knew what you were getting into," Thomas recalled him saying. The words cut him like a blade. In a world where they had hoped for justice, where they had been told that the law was the same for everyone, in their moment of trouble they had simply been abandoned, because to this man they were strangers, because he saw them not as people, but as a problem. "Thomas, look!" Michelle screamed, her voice filled with horror. Thomas turned to see the water starting to wash over the attic. The waves were already reaching their feet, and were getting higher with each passing minute. Thomas desperately tried to lift boxes and beams, trying to create some kind of barrier, but it was pointless. The force of the elements was inexorable. The water rose, washing away everything in its path. And then the sound of an engine was heard again. Thomas froze, his heart skipping a beat with hope. Maybe it was another policeman, maybe someone had finally come for them. Pierced his heart. It was the same patrol car. The policeman was back again, mocking them as he watched their chances of survival dwindle with each passing moment. Thomas saw the headlights of his car stop right in front of their house. The policeman walked out slowly, standing again at a safe distance, his arms crossed over his chest, as if enjoying the spectacle. "Well," he shouted loudly over the roar of the wind, "how do you like it up there? Wet, huh?" "Please," Michelle cried again, her voice full of tears. "For God's sake, help us, our children, they could die." The policeman narrowed his eyes mockingly, his eyes flashing with the cold light of the headlights. "Who said I should help?" His voice sounded with open contempt. "You always want more than you deserve. You live on our taxes, complain about the police, demand equality, and when trouble comes, who's the first to cry for help? You, as usual." "This isn't the time for this," Thomas shouted, his voice shaking with impotent rage. "We're all human. Damn it, you have to help." "Should?" The officer shook his head, his grin growing wider. "And who said that I owe you anything? You chose your own life. You chose this path. I am not here to save those who do not appreciate our work." "This isn't about work," Michelle screamed, her eyes wide with horror. "This is about our children's lives. You can't leave us." The policeman looked at her, then turned his gaze to Thomas, his eyes glinting coldly in the lightning. "Maybe if you had behaved differently," he began, "if you had respected the authorities, respected the law, then I would have helped you now. But you know what? I am tired of your people, of your claims and eternal complaints. You do not deserve help." Thomas froze, his heart clenched at the words. He wanted to say something, but he didn't have the strength. He realized that this man was enjoying their suffering, that he had decided to become judge and executioner in one moment. The policeman didn't just not want to help, he enjoyed the fact that they no longer had a choice. "We're going to die," Thomas whispered, realizing the depth of the situation. "He left us to die." Michelle closed her eyes, holding the children tightly to her. Thomas stood on the edge of the roof, the cold water rising rapidly, hugging his legs and making him feel like the ground was slipping away from under him. He felt his heart squeeze with fear, but there was a fire in his eyes, a desire to save his family, to protect his wife and children at any cost. Panic-stricken, Michelle clung to Lisa and Jason as if to protect them from whatever was waiting for them in the raging storm. She knew time was running out, but her mind was racing with thoughts of what would happen to her children if they stayed here. How long could they fight the rising storm that threatened to swallow them whole? "I can't lose them," she blurted out as she looked at her husband again, her voice sounding like she was about to burst into tears. A sense of hopelessness was growing within her, as if all the troubles of the world had been dumped on her shoulders. "We won't lose them, Michelle," Thomas tried to assure her, but his voice sounded just like hers, full of fear. "We'll find a way out, I promise." Michelle looked at her children. Lisa was clutching her toy that she had brought with her, but her little hands were shaking. Jason was clinging to her, his eyes full of tears. He didn't understand what was happening, but he felt that this wasn't just a game. He could see how worried his mother was, and it was too much for him. "Mom," Jason said quietly, raising his head, "we're going to leave, right? Everything's going to be okay?" As if it were a magic spell, his question aroused even more fear in Michelle. She knew that it was impossible to promise him anything. They could no longer wait for help to arrive. And that policeman, standing at a safe distance, became for her a symbol of complete indifference to their suffering. "Yes, baby, we're leaving," she forced herself to say, even though everything inside her screamed that it was a lie. She felt her heart breaking with the knowledge that she couldn't protect her children, that they could have fallen victim not only to the hurricane, but to the hatred personified in this policeman. "Please," she screamed again, turning to the policeman, who was still standing with his arms crossed over his chest, looking at them with disdain. "You have to help us. You can't just stand there and watch us drown. We have children. They can't see this." But his face didn't change. He didn't show any compassion, no sign of humanity. His icy eyes just mocked them as if they were just a joke. "It is my duty to maintain order," he said, his voice sounding as if he were delivering a sentence. "And your order is your problem." These words pierced Michelle like a knife. She wanted to scream, she wanted to rush to him, but she understood that it would only destroy her. In her mind, everything merged into one unbearable picture: her family, her children, whom she could not save, whom this man had betrayed. It was not just unbearable pain, it was despair that seemed to be trying to strangle her. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice shaking with fear, "what if we don't get out? What if they don't survive?" Thomas hugged her, feeling her body tremble with fear and hopelessness. He saw the shadows of fear playing on her face, how she tried to be strong, but every drop of water, every wave crashing onto the roof, only brought them closer to the edge. "I won't let that happen," he said, but there was an uncertainty in his voice that he couldn't hide. He knew he wasn't in control of the situation. The wind continued to howl like a wild animal demanding its prey. Lightning began to fall from the sky again, tearing the darkness apart. At that moment, Thomas saw the water suddenly cover the steps leading to their door, and horror gripped him. Thoughts flashed through his mind that they might not make it in time. He couldn't let his family become another victim of the elements, another name lost in statistics. "We have to get out of here, now," he said, looking around for an exit. He saw that the wind had scattered some of their belongings, leaving only the miserable remains of their lives. "But how?" Michelle asked, sounding like she was ready to give up. "How can we do this? We can't just jump into this water." "I know," he shouted, his voice full of determination. "We can try to get to the car. It's parked by the road. We can get to it. We can't stay here." The policeman standing to the side laughed again, his laughter piercing the silence of the night like a blade. "Ha, do you really think you can get out of there? If you don't get help from the society you hate so much, how are you going to cope with a hurricane? You can't even take care of yourself." The words were like a poisonous bite. Michelle felt a chill creep into her heart, as this man's threat, not just physical but emotional, threatened everything they had done. She didn't know how to answer him, how to justify their existence when he saw them as nothing more than targets for his hatred. "We won't give up," she shouted, and her voice, filled with power, seemed to burn her. She turned to the children, who looked at her with hope and fear. "We will get out of here, I promise." Thomas grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly, as if it was the only thing keeping them afloat. They both knew this was their last chance, the last moment they could pull together and fight for their lives, for the lives of their children. "Hold on tight," he shouted before looking back at Michelle. "We'll do this together. For the kids." They turned toward the edge of the roof, and Thomas felt fear seep into every cell of his body. But it wasn't just the fear of the hurricane, it was the worry that if they failed, their children might become victims of this evil world, or even in their hour of need they could count on no help. "Please stick together," Michelle said, her voice full of determination. "We'll do this for our children." Thomas nodded, and in that moment they both realized that they could not give up, even in the face of hatred and fear. The wind fought with their house, throwing it like a toy into the endless ocean. Every blow of the wave caused horror in the children. They watched as the water came closer and closer to them, like a greedy mouth ready to swallow everything. Lisa pressed herself against her mother, her little heart pounding in her chest as if it wanted to break out. She did not understand what was happening, but instinctively she felt, this was not just a game, this was something terrible. "Mommy, I'm scared," she said, sobbing, her voice sounding like a thin bell breaking through the noise of a hurricane. "I'm here, my girl, I'm here," Michelle reassured her, trying not to show her fear, but inside her heart, a hurricane raged, equal to the one raging outside. She held Lisa so tightly that she lost her breath, but it was the only way to keep her safe. Jason, sitting next to his sister, looked at his father, his eyes full of tears and confusion. He, like Lisa, felt that something terrible was happening, but he didn't know how to explain it. The moment their father screamed for help, fear enveloped him like a thick veil. "Dad," he whispered quietly, "what will happen if we don't get out?" Thomas looked at his son and his heart sank. He saw fear in Jason's eyes that no child should ever feel. He couldn't let himself break, knowing that his family stood behind him. "We will get out," he said, though his voice was shaking. "We will do it together. We are strong, and we will not give up." Yet every sound, every blast of the elements made the children tremble. Lisa began to sob again, her voice mixing with the roar of the wind, and even in this chaos, Thomas felt his soul being torn apart. He felt helpless. He couldn't protect them from the storm. He couldn't save them from the hatred they faced. "Mom," Lisa asked again, her little hands seeking comfort, "is the policeman not going to come to our aid?" Michelle looked at the children, her heart filled with bitterness. She knew that this question remained unanswered, and this policeman they had put their hopes in had become a symbol of everything terrible they had experienced. He might just be busy, Michelle tried to explain, though she didn't believe her own words. She knew she couldn't give them hope if everything inside her was crumbling. At that moment, there was a loud crack and the part of the roof where they were, like a dream, began to collapse. Jason screamed and Lisa clung to her mother, her fear growing even stronger. "Dad," he cried, his voice in unison with the crack, "we're not going to die, are we?" Thomas rushed towards the children, trying to get them to their feet, but the excitement was covered by a wave of madness. "No, Jason, we're not going to die," he tried to assure his son, although deep down he knew that every second counted. Michelle was on the verge of breaking down. Her feelings vacillated between hope and despair. She saw the children clutching each other, trying to find comfort in their fear, and her heart broke at the sight. She couldn't let them see her lose her confidence. "We have to get down," she shouted, trying to be heard above the roar of the storm. "We need to find a safe place." But how could they get out when the wind whistled like a wild beast and the water around them only increased? Lisa, looking at the collapsed roof, sobbed and said, "Mom, I'm scared. I don't want to die." As if the hurricane had answered her words, another gust of wind slammed into their shelter. It was the moment when fear became tangible, when it took them in its hands and began to strangle them. "I'm scared too," Michelle admitted, her voice shaking like the children's. She knew she couldn't lie to them anymore. That fear was truly a part of their existence now. She knew they were all trapped, with no way out. Thomas stepped forward and picked up Lisa, and Jason grabbed Michelle's hand. "We'll get out," he said again, but he wasn't so sure. He knew their situation was critical, and any moment could be their last. "But how?" Michelle repeated, her heart stopping. At that moment, a sound like a rumble was heard again, and the roof beneath them began to crack. Fear gripped the children, and they screamed at the same time, as if it was the only way to cope with the reality that surrounded them. "This way," Thomas shouted, leading them to the edge of the roof. "We have to get to the car." But as soon as they began to descend, the walls around them began to crack, as if they themselves wanted to break away from the ground and go into the dark depths. Lisa, clinging to her father, screamed, "Dad, I don't want to go into the water." I know," Thomas replied, but it was only a whisper. He was afraid, too. Every drop of rain burned like poisonous rain, and the wind tore everything in its path. They found themselves in the center of a real nightmare, and even the policeman who was supposed to protect them became part of their fear. At that moment, when everything around them was torn apart, they realized that the real threat was not only in nature, but also in human hatred, which manifested itself so cruelly. "We can't get through," Jason screamed again, his voice low and pained. Thomas turned to the children and, looking into their frightened eyes, felt that they had to get out, that they had to be together, despite all the suffering. "We can handle it," he repeated, but he no longer believed it. Michelle, hugging the children, felt her own strength begin to drain. "We will not leave each other," she said, despite the fact that every sound of the hurricane told them otherwise. But every blow of the water, every whistle of the wind echoed in their hearts with hopelessness, and even when they tried to rally, fear ate away at them from within. Thomas held Lisa in his arms while Jason held tightly to his mother's hand. The wind tore them apart, and the waters of the hurricane were closing in on them like greedy hands ready to swallow them. And then, just when it seemed like disaster was about to happen, the policeman standing at the edge finally spoke up. "So, are you still hoping for help?" His voice was tinged with contempt, and there was not a drop of sympathy in it. "Why do you even need this? You chose to stay here, as if it wasn't obvious that no one needs you." Thomas felt rage flare in his chest. He couldn't believe that this man, who was supposed to protect, could be so indifferent, so cruel. There was no hint of humanity in his eyes, only coldness and contempt. "Please," he said, trying to remain calm, "we have children. We can't stay here." The policeman just chuckled, his lips curling into a sarcastic grin. "Don't you think that's your problem?" he said, mockingly. "Who made you stay in such a place when a hurricane is coming? Your brothers and sisters and mine would probably see a different fate." Thomas felt hatred and pain fill his heart. He knew this was no simple misunderstanding. This was the face of racism lurking in the crowd, and now it was revealed in all its terrible beauty. "We're trying to save our children," he shouted, rage seething inside him. "They've done nothing wrong. They don't deserve this." The policeman looked with contempt at the children who were trembling with fear and cold, and there was nothing but indifference in his gaze. "They're just more small fry," he said with a light laugh. "Nothing of any consequence in this world. You should get used to it before it's too late." Lisa, clinging to her mother, asked a question that hurt everyone. "Why does he hate us?" Her voice sounded like she couldn't understand how that was possible. Michelle, unable to hold back her tears, replied, "I don't know, my dear." Her voice was full of pain. "Some people just don't understand that we are all equal." The policeman turned to them with a grin as if they were toys he could easily break. "Equal?" he said mockingly. "Look at yourself. You just don't want to admit it. A person is what you see. Look at yourself in the mirror." At that moment, Thomas felt his anger becoming uncontrollable. He couldn't just stand there and listen to this humiliation. It was too much. He knew he had no right to rise up against the law, but his family was on the edge. "You just hate us because of the color of our skin," he shouted. "You're not a man. You're just a monster." The policeman just smirked, his cold gaze leaving no room for doubt. "Do you think your life matters?" he said, looking at the children with an expression of indifference. "You chose this path. You choose to stay here when the storm comes. Why should you help?" A storm of protest erupted inside Thomas. He knew they were at their most vulnerable, and perhaps that was why this man was enjoying their suffering. He saw Lisa cower in fear, and that was the last straw. "We don't deserve this," he shouted, his voice full of despair. "We're here because we need to survive, and you know it." The policeman grinned and stepped closer, his face becoming more sullen. "You know, I've always thought that people like you love victims," he said sarcastically, "and here she is, a real victim. You chose your fate, and now don't complain about the consequences." The policeman's words were like knives piercing Thomas's heart. He felt his chest tighten with pain and hatred. He couldn't believe that such a person even existed. "You have no right to say that," he shouted, feeling the rage flaring up inside him. "You're supposed to be protecting people, not bullying them." "Protect?" The policeman chuckled again. "I'm here to keep order, and you don't seem to fit in." Thomas felt anger rising in him. He knew that if they didn't get out of here, If they didn't get help, they might become victims not only of the hurricane, but also of the hatred that raged inside this policeman. "We're leaving," he said decisively, taking Michelle's hand. "We won't let this man break us. We'll fight for our family." The policeman chuckled again, and there was not a drop of sympathy in his gaze. "Good luck with that," he said with disdain, his voice full of mockery. "I hope you can survive in your miserable reality." With every word the policeman spoke, the tension grew and the air became menacing. Michelle, feeling the hopelessness of the situation, held the children close, knowing that they had to move on now, despite the fear that was closing in on them like darkness. "We can do this," she whispered, trying to be strong for the children. "We're together, and we'll never give up." Thomas, determined, looked at the policeman with a determination that grew stronger with each passing moment. He knew he had to try again. His family depended on it. "Look," he began, trying to sound calm even as emotions raged inside him. "We're not antagonizing you. We just want our kids to be safe. This hurricane could kill us all." The policeman looked at him with displeasure, his eyes shining with contempt. "So what? It's your problem. You chose this path yourself," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Why should I worry about you? You're not important to me." "You're a police officer," Thomas said again, hoping the word would change something. "Your job is to protect people. We don't want anything bad. We just want to get away from this hurricane." Lisa, still clinging to her mother, looked at the policeman with her big, frightened eyes. "Please," she said, her voice full of innocence, "we don't want to die. Help us. We're just a family who wants to be safe." The policeman froze for a moment, and something like doubt flashed across his face, but it was quickly replaced by the same indifference. "Please," Michelle repeated, her voice shaking with fear. "We're begging you. Help us get out of here. You can see what's happening." "I don't have to do anything to you," the policeman said again, his tone as cold as ice. "It's your life, and if you can't take care of yourself, it's none of my business." Thomas felt the anger rise up inside him again and he clenched his fists. "But you can help," he cried, his voice full of despair. "We are people, just like you. Don't you understand that we are in danger?" The policeman chuckled again, and his voice became even more contemptuous. "Oh, yes, you're just like everyone else, but you know what? I don't see anything in you that's worth saving. You're just one of many pathetic families that can't take care of themselves." In those moments of humiliation and helplessness, Michelle seemed to be losing hope, but looking at her children, she knew she couldn't give up. She had to try again. "Please," she said, trying to sound confident, "think of your own children. Wouldn't you do anything to keep them safe?" The policeman froze for a moment, but then his face again assumed an indifferent expression. "My children are safe," he said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "They are not here, and I am not going to risk my career for you." Thomas couldn't believe it. All his rage poured out into words. "You refuse to help the family because we are a different color? This is terrible. We are not going to stay here and wait for the elements to destroy us." "It's not my problem," the policeman said again, and there was not a drop of emotion in his voice. Every moment spent with this man seemed agonizing, and every refusal only caused a growing feeling of despair. "But you're a human being," Thomas cried, unable to contain his emotions. "How can you be so heartless? If that's not racism, what is it?" The policeman stared at him with contempt. "Let's not make this personal," he said. "I'm not going to discuss my views." Lisa, sobbing, pulled her mother by the sleeve. "Mom," she said, "why is he so angry? We just want to leave." It was like a blow to the heart. Michelle hugged her daughter and, feeling helpless, said, "I don't know, baby, but we have to be strong. We can't give up." Thomas looked at the policeman and tried again to reach his humanity. "Listen," he said, "these aren't just words. We're in danger. Every moment you waste playing your game could cost us our lives. You don't want the deaths of innocent people on your conscience, do you?" The policeman finally moved, his cold gaze frozen for a moment, but then he grinned mockingly again. "You need to learn from your mistakes. You are not supposed to rely on others when you can't take care of yourself." With every word the policeman spoke, the tension grew and fear once again enveloped the family. They stood on the edge of a precipice, while this man was ready to watch them fall. "We won't give up," Michelle said, feeling her inner strength draining, but she couldn't allow herself to appear weak. "We'll fight for our family." "That's good," The policeman grinned. Be afraid while you can, but don't count on me. I'm just doing my job. Thomas, disappointed and angry, looked at his children. Filled with fear and uncertainty, he realized that the policeman who was supposed to be their protector had become their worst enemy. This is not the end, he said, feeling a fire ignite inside him. We will find a way to get out of here, and no one will stop us. With this feeling of determination and hatred, they began to retreat, embracing each other, knowing that even in the face of hatred, they had to stay together. But deep down, each of them knew that even if they got out of this nightmare, the shadow cast by this policeman would remain with them forever. The wind howled around them as if with a mad fury, a harbinger of an approaching hurricane. The children shivered with cold and fear, and time slipped away. Thomas knew that they had no more time. The hurricane was approaching with inexorable speed, and every second was precious. We have to go, he shouted, trying to collect his thoughts. We need to find a way out of here before it's too late. Michelle, still holding Lisa and Jason close to her, looked at him with concern. But where can we go? This policeman, he won't help us. He doesn't want to save us. Maybe we should try to convince him one more time, Thomas said, feeling anger and fear intertwining inside him. If he sees how bad we really are. The policeman, watching them, suddenly came closer, his face distorted into an evil grin. You still think I can help you? He said, his voice like the whisper of a poisonous snake. Don't you realize you're out of place here? We just want to get out of here, Thomas shouted, realizing that his words did not touch this man. You should not care about our lives. The policeman just smirked and stepped towards him. There was a fire in his eyes that Thomas couldn't ignore. He knew this could lead to something bad, but all he felt was anger. Oh, you really don't understand, the policeman said, his voice dropping dangerously low. No one is going to save you, least of all me. He stepped closer, and at that moment Thomas felt his heart beat faster. The sounds of the approaching storm were all around them, but the noise and terror coming from the policeman seemed far more threatening. Get away from us, he shouted, stepping forward as the policeman began to approach. We don't want to quarrel with you. But the policeman only grinned in response, and cruelty flashed in his eyes. Oh, yeah, you think I'm afraid of you? He said, his voice threatening. You probably thought you could get what you wanted just because you were here. Suddenly he pushed Thomas, and he, not expecting the blow, stumbled back. Lisa screamed, and Michelle, jumping up, came up to him, looking at the policeman with horror. Don't touch him, she screamed, her voice filled with despair. We didn't hurt you. But you're not going to, said the policeman, advancing with a sullen expression on his face. I can do anything I want to you, and you won't be able to do anything. He pushed Thomas again, and he barely managed to stay on his feet. The air was tense, and the hurricane's fury was growing. Please, Michelle said, her voice shaking with fear. We only want to save our children. We mean you no harm. It's not my problem, the policeman said, and there was no longer any mockery in his voice. He came closer, and his shadow fell over the family like a gathering darkness. But maybe you'll learn something today. At that moment, Thomas, gathering his last strength, rushed forward, wanting to protect his family. He knew it could be dangerous, but he couldn't let this man humiliate them any further. Get out, he shouted, but the policeman only grinned. You have no idea what a real threat is, he said, approaching him. Thomas, sensing that a fight was inevitable, raised his hand in defense. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was determined. You can't stop us, he shouted as a policeman grabbed him by the chest and pushed him hard to the ground. Thomas fell, and it was a blow to him. He knew that this could all end badly, but he also knew that he could not retreat. You have no right to treat us like this, Michelle screamed, rushing towards the police officer, but he pushed her aside. Lisa and Jason clung to their mother in fear, their eyes full of tears. You're just another problem, the policeman said, his words cutting like a blade, and I'm not going to waste my time on pathetic people who can't handle reality. Thomas rose to his feet, and with each passing second he felt the fear and rage growing. He could not let this policeman break his spirit. We're not leaving until we get help, he shouted, his voice growing more confident. We won't give in to your threats. At that moment, the policeman, losing his patience, stepped towards him and, raising his hand, hit him. Thomas felt the pain pierce him, but this only spurred him on. You can't scare us, he shouted, rising to his feet. We will still fight for our children." But the policeman just grinned and raised his fist, ready to hit again. He seemed as relentless as the hurricane bearing down on them. Thomas was hardening inside, and he wasn't going to give in. "I won't let you break our family," he said, full of determination. The family stood shoulder to shoulder, their spirit and strength united, ready to face this terrible policeman. The storm was raging around them, but the real battle was happening here, and they knew they had to stand up to save each other, no matter what the odds. The sounds of the approaching storm were growing louder around them, and time was running out. But even in this despair, when the policeman seemed to be filled with hatred and malice, a spark of hope lit in Thomas's heart. He knew that if they united, they could overcome this threat. "We will not give up," he said, his voice becoming more confident. "We will fight for our children, and nothing can stop us." The policeman sneered, but that only spurred Thomas on. He turned to Michelle and the children, his voice growing louder. "Look, we have to work together. If one of us can distract him, the rest can try to get away." "How do we do this?" Michelle asked, her eyes full of worry. "He's too strong and aggressive." "I know," Thomas said, looking around at his surroundings. "But if we can distract him, maybe someone can find a way out." Suddenly Lisa, tormented by fear, said, "Dad, we can't just leave. He'll catch us." "We're not just going to leave," Thomas replied, his voice softening. "We're doing this together. We're family, and we're not leaving each other." The situation seemed hopeless, but Thomas felt there was still a chance. He looked at the policeman, who seemed to be losing patience, and decided to act. "Look," he said, trying to sound calm, "we just want to get away. You don't want our kids to be victims of a hurricane, do you?" The policeman paused for a moment, and a look of doubt flashed in his eyes, but he quickly returned to his sullen expression. "You think you can fool me?" he said, his voice threatening. "No," Thomas said, trying to remain calm, "but I think you have a chance to prove that you're human. If you let us go, you can say you made the right choice." Lisa, clinging to her mother, whispered, "Dad, what if he doesn't let us go?" "Don't worry, baby," Michelle said, hugging her. "We'll find a way to get out." And at that moment, when the tension reached its peak, Thomas decided to take a risk. He stepped forward again and looked the policeman in the eye with a challenge. "You can't make us stay here," he said. "We're not going to wait for a hurricane to destroy us. We have children who need protection." The policeman stopped for a moment, as if confused. "Look, I'm not going to play with you," he said, but there was already a hint of doubt in his voice. "We're not asking for much," Michelle added, her voice growing more confident. "We just want our children to be safe. We're all human, and we all have the right to be protected." At that moment, as they tried to reach his humanity, the wind howled even louder, and fear enveloped them again. But something in the family's words, their tenacity, began to have an effect on the policeman. "I can't just let you go," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "We don't want problems," Thomas said, trying to be as convincing as possible. "We're just looking for a way out. You know it's the right thing to do." The policeman looked at them, and something that could be called doubt flashed in his eyes. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice less aggressive, "but I still can't let you go. Maybe we have a chance if we just talk," Thomas said, seeing that his words were beginning to get through to the policeman. "We can find a way out together." And then something unexpected happened. The policeman suddenly stepped back, his face contorted as if he was thinking about everything that had happened. "Okay," he said, hesitating slightly, "I'll give you some time, but if you decide to try to escape, I won't stand for it." Thomas, feeling a surge of hope, quickly turned to his family. "We need to go," he said, grabbing Lisa's hand and heading to the edge of the road. "Let's try to find a safe place." Michelle nodded and they started to move, but at that moment the policeman seemed to come to his senses again. "Hey!" he shouted, but Thomas could already feel their family starting to move away. They ran to the nearest shelter, an old abandoned school. Every step was difficult. Fear was taking hold of them again, but hope finally flared up in their hearts. They knew this was their chance. As soon as they reached the school doors, Michelle looked at the children. "We must be careful," she said, "but we are safe here for a while." They quickly walked inside, and Michelle closed the door behind her. It was dark and quiet inside, and each of them felt a heavy weight of fear and uncertainty. "We did it," Thomas said, sitting down on the floor. "We took a step towards safety. But we still can't relax. Michelle added. The hurricane is still approaching, and it could come at any moment. Lisa and Jason, still shaking with fear, clung to their mother, but a spark of hope lit up their eyes. We'll get through this, Thomas said, rising to his feet. We're together, and that's the most important thing. Gathering their strength, they began to explore the school, looking for shelter from the approaching elements. Every corner seemed mysterious, and their hearts began to beat faster when they heard the wind howling outside the walls. Maybe we can find a way to the attic, Lisa suggested, her voice sounding determined. Thomas nodded and they climbed the creaking stairs, leading each other by the hand. Each step was hard, but they were determined to find a place where the hurricane couldn't reach them. When they got to the attic, they found abandoned items and old furniture. Michelle found an old tent and, feeling that it could be a temporary shelter, began to pitch it. We can use this as protection, she said, trying to remain confident. And although fear still tormented them, they knew that they had taken the first step towards salvation. Their family was together, and despite all the trials, they were not going to give up. We'll get through this, Thomas said again, looking at his children. We're a family, and we'll get through this. With each passing moment, their confidence and their strength grew, and even in those dark moments when everything seemed hopeless, they began to understand that unity was their real weapon against the coming storm. As the wind died down and the dull roar of the storm faded into the distance, the family felt the tension finally begin to ease. Thomas and Michelle did everything they could to make sure the children were safe. They spent several hours in the old building, listening to the sounds outside the windows, and when it became truly quiet outside, they began to discuss what to do next. We have to get out of town, Thomas said, looking at Michelle with determination in his eyes. The storm is over, but we need to make sure that cop doesn't come after us. But how will we leave? Michelle asked, looking around. The car might be damaged. We can try to find another one, Thomas replied, his voice sounding determined. The main thing is to get out of this place. Lisa and Jason, still reeling from the experience, looked at their parents with hope. We can do it, right? Lisa asked, her voice shaking with excitement. Yes, we can, Thomas said confidently. We just need to stay together and be careful. Once they were ready, they began to leave the abandoned building, carefully stepping up the stairs as they creaked under their weight. As they stepped outside, the world seemed almost lifeless. The destruction left by the storm was everywhere, but that wasn't the worst part. What worried them more was that the police officer might still be out there somewhere. Thomas remembered his face, angry and hateful. He remembered the name on his uniform, O'Brien. This policeman had become a symbol of all the hardships and humiliations his family had faced. They couldn't just forget what had happened. Let's find some kind of transport, he suggested, looking at his children. We need to move before it's too late. They moved slowly down the street, trying to remain unnoticed. Luckily, they soon came across an old van. The paint was peeling, but it looked intact enough to drive to safety. We can try, Thomas said, running to the car and checking the doors. They were open, and after a quick assessment of the situation, he realized that this might be their chance. Sit down, he said when everyone was gathered inside. We have to leave here right now. As they climbed into the van, Thomas felt his heart pounding with excitement. He looked at the children, who seemed full of hope. Let's just do it, he said, starting to start the engine. The van struggled to get going, but soon they were moving. Thomas carefully pulled out onto the road, leaving behind them the city, a reminder of all the horror they had faced. Despite the difficulties, he felt his confidence gradually returning, but in his heart there was still resentment and anger towards Policeman O'Brien. When the storm passes, I will definitely raise this issue, he said, turning to Michelle. We need to talk about this. This cannot go unpunished. I agree, she replied, looking at him with support. We must fight for justice not only for our family, but for everyone who faces racism. Thomas nodded, realizing that their experience could help others. He thought about how important it was to share this story to bring attention to the challenges facing black families. We're not alone, he said, looking at the children. If we can change even one thing, it will make a difference. As the van slowly pulled out of town, Thomas felt his resolve grow stronger. This journey would not only be an escape from the horrors of the hurricane, but also the beginning of a new fight for rights and equality. Despite the suffering they had endured, he knew they would not remain silent. They had family, they had hope, and they were willing to do whatever it took to stop the hatred and inequality they faced. As they drove out of town, Thomas looked at Michelle and the children. They were together, and it gave him strength. He knew there would be many difficulties ahead, but it only strengthened his desire to fight for justice. There was a fire burning in their hearts, and despite all the dark moments, they knew they could be part of something bigger. And when the storm passed, they would prepare to fight again to show that hate cannot defeat love and unity. As Thomas drove out of town, his thoughts were filled with images of his family. He looked in the rearview mirror at his children huddled together in the back seat, and a sense of security filled his heart. All the suffering and humiliation they had endured was now behind them, but he knew that this was not the end of their struggle. Every turn in the road reminded him of how important it was to protect his family and give them what they deserved: safety and love. He remembered Officer O'Brien looking at them with disdain, as if their lives meant nothing. But in that moment, outside of this town, he felt like he had the opportunity to make a difference. "We'll get through this," he said quietly, turning to Michelle, who was looking at him with tenderness and support. "I promise you that I'll do everything to keep our family safe." "I believe you," she replied, her voice full of confidence. "You know it's important." But there was still a heavy weight on his heart, the thought of a police officer who had ruthlessly displayed racism, hatred, and indifference. O'Brien should not have gotten away with it. These thoughts filled his mind as they left the city. "I want him to answer for what he did," Thomas said, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Not just for us, but for everyone who deals with this every day." Michelle nodded, understanding how important this was. She knew their family had been through hell, and that incidents like this happen all too often. This wasn't just a personal matter, it was a fight for justice for everyone who faced racism. "We could contact the organization," she suggested. "Maybe they could help us get this to the right people." Thomas thought for a moment, his resolve growing. He knew they had the opportunity to do something important. They were not alone, and their experience could be a voice for those who could not speak for themselves. "Yes," he said, looking ahead to where a new, safer place was beginning to appear on the horizon. "We can get this story out to people, and maybe something will change." He felt the anger and hurt building into a desire for action. They had to tell their stories so that other families could avoid such horrors. With every kilometer they traveled, Thomas became filled with hope. He knew that their family's life would never be the same, but in this new beginning, he would fight to ensure that no one else suffered the way they did. As they left the city and headed into the unknown, he knew that many trials lay ahead, but with this thought of his family and the desire to change the world for the better in his heart, he felt stronger. He was ready to move forward, to fight for truth and justice. And in this new chapter of their lives, where fear had given way to hope, they knew their voice could be part of the change. This was not just their story, but the story of everyone who had faced hatred and prejudice. They were willing to go the extra mile to make this world a better place for their children. Thank you for watching our story. We really want to know what you think about it. Leave your comments below. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Your stories and opinions mean a lot to us, and we value each and every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video if you enjoyed it. Let's help those in trouble together. Write in the comments how you think we can help those affected by the hurricane. Have a nice day and remember that together we can make the world a better place.